I was grabbing coffee with an old friend recently, someone I've always known as the sensible one, the person who consistently voted for the steady, middle-of-the-road candidates because stability is everything. He's a high school teacher, the kind of guy who spent 20 years believing that if you just follow the rules, the system will catch you when you fall. But as we sat there, he started scrolling through his phone, showing me these grainy, aggressive clips of protests and border updates from accounts I'd never heard of. His face, usually so calm and academic, was tight, almost twitchy. He kept using one word: fairness. He wasn't talking about macroeconomics or GDP. He was talking about the 6-month wait for his daughter's specialist appointment and the fact that the local primary school has had under construction signs out front since 2022, while the roof continues to leak. "It's not that I've become some radical," he said, leaning in so close I could smell the burnt espresso. "It's just that I'm tired of being the only one still playing by a rule book while the people in charge are busy tearing out the pages." He looked at a group of students nearby and whispered something about luxury beliefs held by people who don't have to worry about the rent. Then came the turn. I mentioned a new environmental subsidy program, the kind of green initiative he would have championed 5 years ago. He didn't just disagree, he laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "The planet is burning, sure," he said, "but I'm the one being asked to buy the fire extinguisher while the people who started the fire are getting a tax credit for the smoke." That shift from a man who defined himself by civic duty to someone finding a grim satisfaction in the rhetoric of disruption felt like watching a fever break. It wasn't that he'd suddenly adopted a new ideology, it was that the temperature of his world had changed, and he was simply looking for a way to stop shivering. This isn't a story about a political swing. It's a look at what happens when the promise of a fair deal starts to feel like a prank.
Wow. Yeah, that exact shift you're describing, that is the defining political mechanism of our time. You look at that teacher and you see this highly localized version of a massive continent-wide fracture. And for our deep dive today, we're going to look right into the mechanics of that fracture. We're unpacking the economic disconnect, the migration narratives, and this huge green lash sweeping across Europe.
Right, because to understand the sheer scale of this, you really have to look at individuals who embody the collapse of that post-war social contract. Take this one account from the research of a man named Lucas. He's a 58-year-old master carpenter in a small town in Thuringia.
Right, Thuringia, which is a place where the economic history alone just carries a tremendous amount of weight.
Exactly. And for decades, Lucas operated his life on a very specific set of assumptions. I mean, he believed completely in what you could call the German dream, that ironclad idea that consistent physical hard work automatically guarantees a stable, dignified retirement.
He held up his end of the bargain. But then the macroeconomic realities began, tearing out the pages of his rule book, just like your friend said. The region implemented this policy called the Mietpreisbremse, which was a highly publicized rent break policy. It was designed to protect citizens from predatory housing markets.
But the policy just failed in its execution. It failed to stop rents from skyrocketing in the nearby city where Lucas's daughter lives. So he's sitting there watching his family get priced out of their own region, despite the government promising they had the situation under control.
And compounding that housing failure, his own energy bills essentially doubled. Wow. When you're a master carpenter relying on a specific margin of savings, doubling your utility costs overnight changes your entire reality. So Lucas finds himself sitting at his kitchen table, looking at his shrinking savings, and experiencing this profound sense of betrayal. The institutions that were supposed to provide a baseline of security were just entirely absent.
Which leads to the manifestation of that betrayal. Because one evening, Lucas was seen at a local political rally. And he wasn't there chanting extreme ideological slogans or calling for the overthrow of the government. He was standing there holding a simple, hand-painted sign that just read, "Who is protecting my home?"
That sign is the perfect distillation of the current political crisis. To Lucas, supporting far-right movements isn't a desire to return to some dark authoritarian past. It acts as a desperate anchor in a present where he genuinely feels the state has prioritized global financial markets or abstract policy goals entirely over the survival of his kitchen table. I mean, he actually expressed feeling like a stranger in his own accounting ledger.
A stranger in your own accounting ledger. That phrase is incredibly powerful. When you look at the sheer exhaustion of individuals who are facing economic forces totally beyond their control, you start to see why the promise of order becomes an overwhelming draw. And it's crucial for us to state here that the critical analysis requires validating that specific housing crisis and the very real pain of that economic strain.
Right, we have to recognize the failure of the rent break and the energy crisis. without allowing that specific pain to be effortlessly harvested by political movements whose ultimate goal is to dismantle the democratic structures that are originally built to provide that protection.
Validation is the necessary first step because the strain is undeniably structural. Germany was fundamentally built on the promise of shared prosperity. It wasn't built on the American model of boundless, unregulated opportunity where extreme risk yields extreme reward. The German model was about security.
And that security is visibly fracturing. You can walk through central Frankfurt today and see the starkest possible contrasts. You have these massive, powerful financial institutions and glass-clad office towers driving the European economy. Yeah. But just mere blocks away from those towers, you have citizens actively sifting through public bins for plastic bottles just to exchange them for a few cents of deposit money.
The visual of the towering euro symbol in Frankfurt standing directly over a district where the welfare system has entirely failed to catch people, it's striking. Charities in that exact area are handing out basic essentials. And the demographic of those standing in those charity lines is trending younger and younger. The social safety net is stretching to the point of tearing.
The numbers back up that visual completely. 18 million Germans are currently living in poverty, or at immediate risk of falling into it. The entire electorate is undergoing a severe fragmentation. It's no longer just a classic divide of conservative versus progressive.
No, it's becoming a hard fracture between homeowners who have equity and renters who are entirely exposed to market whims. You have secure, salaried professionals on one side and a highly precarious working class on the other.
And when you look at the empirical data, the correlation between this specific type of economic deprivation and radical voting patterns is undeniable. Researchers don't just look at broad national moods, they look at extremely granular data. They analyze German federal election outcomes down at the county level, specifically utilizing what statisticians call the NetTS3 regional classification.
Let me break down exactly what that NetTS3 data tracks, because the methodology really matters here. Researchers studied the timelines between 1998 and 2017. They didn't just ask people how they felt, they measured exact financial realities using 3 distinct metrics. First, the standard poverty rate, which just measures the total number of people below the line. But more importantly, they measured the poverty gap and the median gap.
Those 2 gaps are where the real story lives. The poverty gap measures the average shortfall from the poverty line. So it doesn't just tell you that someone is poor, it tells you exactly how deep underwater they are. It measures the raw intensity of their deprivation. Right. The median gap, on the other hand, measures the average shortfall from the national median income. It measures how far behind the normal middle-class standard a person has fallen.
And the statistical impacts of those specific gaps are staggering. The data proves that a mere 1 percentage point increase in the poverty gap correlates directly with a 1.2 percentage point rise in radical right-wing votes across the board.
But the defining moment in the data occurs during the 2017 federal elections. During that specific election cycle, that exact same 1 percentage point increase in the poverty gap did not just lead to a 1.2% rise, it led to an explosive 4.9 percentage point surge, specifically for the Alternative for Germany, the AfD party.
A 4.9 percentage point leap based on a 1% increase in the intensity of poverty is a massive statistical transfer of political power. And you also have to factor in the geographic divide, because poverty does not exist in a vacuum, it exists in history. The effect of that economic deprivation on AfD vote shares is roughly 3 times larger in East German counties than it is in West German counties.
That 3 times multiplier is crucial. It proves that the historical disparities from the post-reunification economic transitions are still entirely active. The loss of industry and the disruption of local economies in the East didn't just cause temporary hardship in the 1990s. It casts a long, permanent shadow that directly dictates modern political behavior today.
Which forces a reevaluation of the old political theories. For a long time, the dominant theory was the losers of modernization concept. The assumption was that radical parties only appealed to the absolute poorest citizens, or the blue-collar manufacturing workers whose specific jobs were outsourced due to globalization.
The data entirely deconstructs that assumption. It is not exclusively the absolute poorest who are turning to radical parties. The phenomenon has penetrated deeply into the middle and upper middle classes. But it happens through a different mechanism, subjective social marginalization.
Subjective marginalization. Middle-class voters who are feeling the squeeze of inflation and energy costs don't necessarily fear waking up tomorrow in absolute poverty or homelessness. What they're experiencing is profound status anxiety.
Sociologists refer to it as the fear of underestimation. It's a concept that first gained prominence when analyzing the middle class during the Weimar Republic, looking at how stable citizens reacted to sudden economic fragility. Today, that exact same fear manifests as a terror of social decline.
These middle-class voters feel a decoupling from mainstream societal progress. Even if their bank account currently looks okay, they perceive a total loss of social integration. They're looking at the trajectory of their community, the failing infrastructure, the cost of their children's future, and realizing the math no longer works.
When you have a massive breakdown of economic security running parallel to this intense status anxiety across the middle class, you create a total vacuum of institutional trust. The state is perceived as failing to provide the basic economic stability it promised.
And nature abhors a vacuum. When the state fails to deliver on the social contract, highly organized political movements immediately pivot to fill that space. But they don't fill it with complex macroeconomic policy proposals to fix housing supply chains or adjust energy subsidies.
No, they fill it by providing highly visible, easily identifiable scapegoats to explain the systemic neglect. And that transition from complex systemic failure to a hypervisible scapegoat is incredibly fast. You can see the exact mechanics of it by looking at what happens at the municipal level. Consider the situation of Elena. She works as a nurse in a former industrial hub located in Saxony.
Elena's environment is defined by municipal decay. Working in the local clinic, she has personally witnessed the funding being slashed year after year. She drives to work on crumbling roads, and the local youth center, which is a crucial piece of civic infrastructure, was permanently closed.
Then the regional government opens a temporary housing facility for refugees. They place it right inside a converted gym near Elena's neighborhood. Now, Elena didn't start out holding any specific grievances against foreigners or migrants. She was just a frontline healthcare worker exhausted by a decaying system.
The shift happens when the political narrative is introduced to the environment. A local far-right councilman held a demonstration pointing directly at that converted gym. He explicitly stated to the town that the exact funding used to keep the lights on in that refugee center was the money that should have been used to fix the leaking roof at the local school and reopen the youth center.
That narrative provides an instant physical explanation for a decade of invisible bureaucratic neglect. Elena began to view the newcomers walking down her street as the actual physical manifestation of her town's decline. The systemic failure of the regional government to invest in local infrastructure over the past 20 years was entirely and conveniently hidden behind a new us versus them narrative.
And Elena's frustration is completely valid. It is a direct human response to a system that is failing to govern effectively. The clinic is underfunded, the roads are crumbling, but this represents the ultimate success of the scapegoat mechanism. Acknowledging the genuine decline in her public services is vital, but the target of her frustration is entirely misplaced.
Right. By misplacing that target, the actual architects of the economic neglect the policymakers who cut the clinic funding long before the gym was converted. They remain completely unscrutinized. The political challenge is how to address the very real strain on local resources, like a small-town clinic suddenly serving a larger population, without employing the dehumanizing rhetoric that ultimately just masks a lack of real policy solutions.
Right-wing populist parties operationalize this exact dynamic. Political scientists refer to their platform as a thin-centered ideology. Let's clearly define what a thin-centered ideology actually is for you, because it's key to understanding their success.
Unlike traditional conservatism or traditional liberalism, which offer comprehensive, dense frameworks for how every aspect of government should function, from trade tariffs to tax brackets to foreign policy, a thin-centered ideology strips all of that away.
They don't need a 500-page policy manifesto. They focus almost entirely on highly visible, easily digestible cultural conflicts. By focusing on the cultural conflict, they successfully shift the public's attention away from those complex macroeconomic failures.
And one of the most effective tools in this thin-centered approach is welfare chauvinism. Welfare chauvinism essentially weaponizes the social safety net. It is the deliberate, calculated depiction of immigrants and refugees not as humans seeking asylum or economic opportunity, but as direct existential threats to the generous welfare programs of Western societies.
The narrative treats the welfare state as a strictly closed, zero-sum system. The argument presented to voters like Elena is that there is a finite pie of resources, and every single resource allocated to a newcomer is a piece of the pie directly stolen from the native-born population.
This requires a very specific rhetorical strategy. The populist movements have largely evolved past explicit traditional racism or xenophobia. Instead, there is a highly disciplined, strategic adoption of nativism. Nativism is a distinct political doctrine. It operates on the core principle that states should be inhabited exclusively by members of the native group, and that any non-native elements, whether persons or ideas, are fundamentally threatening to the homogeneous nation-state.
Populist leaders use nativism to construct a very specific triangle of conflict. They pit the ordinary native people at the bottom against two distinct enemies. The first enemy is the cosmopolitan elite, the politicians and bureaucrats who are perceived as recklessly opening the borders from the safety of their gated communities.
And the second enemy is the immigrants themselves. This triad exploits deep nostalgic feelings about identity, local culture, and tradition. It provides a clean, simple narrative structure for voters who feel overwhelmed by globalized complexity. And this base narrative is routinely amplified by the strategic spread of specific conspiracy theories.
The Great Replacement theory is the most prominent example of this. It has moved from the absolute fringe of the internet directly into mainstream European political discourse.
You see it propagated by major political figures across the entire continent. Eric Zemmour and Marine Le Pen utilize it in France. Thierry Baudet pushes it in the Netherlands. Alexander Gauland in Germany, Viktor Orban in Hungary. They all utilize variations of this single theory.
The theory is entirely designed to reframe the nature of migration. It tells the voter that migration is not a humanitarian crisis resulting from distant civil wars. It tells them migration is not an economic necessity designed to prop up the pension systems of rapidly aging European populations. Instead, it frames migration as a calculated malicious strategy.
It frames it as an intentional demographic engineering project orchestrated by those cosmopolitan elites to deliberately dilute the native culture and replace the voting base. When you frame migration as an active attack rather than a passive crisis, the political response it demands becomes inherently more extreme.
Which brings up the fundamental paradox of populist governance. The entire political momentum of right-wing populist parties relies on the migration crisis never actually being solved.
That is the core mechanical truth of their operation. They have a vested structural interest in maintaining a perpetual state of emergency at the border. If the migration issue were somehow cooperatively managed, or if infrastructure was adequately funded to absorb newcomers seamlessly, their primary mobilizing tool would completely vanish.
The permanent crisis acts as a guaranteed floor for their political support. As long as there is friction, they have relevance. And simultaneously, it acts as a permanent diversion from the systemic domestic issues. As long as the councilman in Saxony is pointing at the converted Jim, no one is asking him for his detailed macroeconomic plan to bring heavy industry back to the region.
The effectiveness of this permanent crisis strategy forces a severe reaction from the mainstream and centrist parties. When centrist politicians look at the polling data and see voters bleeding away to populist factions, their institutional response is often to try and outflank the populists. They attempt to recapture the electorate by adopting harsher, more restrictive migration policies themselves.
They start mirroring the language of the fringe, and in doing so, they shift the entire Overton window, which is the range of policies politically acceptable to the mainstream population. Policies of severe exclusion, aggressive deterrence, and mass deportation move from the radical fringe directly to the center of the political debate.
You can track this cross-European normalization clearly. In the Netherlands, Geert Wilders secures massive electoral victories by constantly warning of foreign infiltration and utilizing extreme rhetoric about the Islamization of the country.
Or look at Italy. Politicians continuously leverage intense anti-migrant narratives to secure power. They do this despite the undeniable reality that Italy is facing a catastrophic demographic crisis. They have an acute, mathematically proven economic need for migrant labor just to sustain their basic agricultural industries and keep their national pension systems solvent. The political narrative entirely ignores the economic mathematical reality.
So you have this incredibly potent populist machinery that has successfully weaponized demographic anxiety and economic deprivation. But migration is just one application of the machine. That exact same political apparatus is currently pivoting. It is being deployed against the other massive systemic transformation defining our era, the transition to a green economy.
The green lash. When you look at how climate policy is being transformed into a cultural battleground, you have to look at the individuals absorbing the impact of these policies at the ground level. Let's detail the experience of Dieter. He is a small-scale grain farmer operating in Brandenburg.
Dieter represents the rural side of this economic fracture. The government announced a series of new environmental regulations, specifically involving new green heating laws and the sudden cutting of agricultural diesel subsidies. To a policymaker in a capital city, cutting a diesel subsidy is a necessary line item to hit a carbon reduction target.
But to Dieter, sitting on his tractor in Brandenburg, those announcements are perceived as an immediate death warrant for his family farm. He perceives those laws as being written by urban bureaucrats who are entirely disconnected from the physical and financial realities of agricultural life.
In Dieter's mind, a massive divide is opened up. He looks at the climate elite urban professionals who can easily afford heavily subsidized electric vehicles and who work in climate-controlled offices while he's literally struggling to afford the fuel required to harvest his grain.
The vulnerability of Dieter's position is immediately recognized by political activists. When right-wing activists visited Dieter's village, they did not bring charts discussing carbon footprints, global emission targets, or parts per million of atmospheric CO2. They completely bypassed the science.
Instead, they focus the entire conversation on cultural pride. They frame the environmental regulations as an attack on rural dignity, calling for resistance against the eco-dictatorship. That framing is deeply intentional.
They take a mundane, utilitarian piece of technology, like an electric heat pump, and they transform it into a powerful, emotionally charged symbol. The heat pump is no longer just a way to heat a house. It becomes the physical embodiment of a hostile urban establishment that actively despises Dieter's traditional way of life.
The bridge between the urban centers and the rural heartlands is completely collapsing. And the root of that collapse isn't just financial. It's about cultural alienation and the fundamental human need for respect and dignity. The transition to a green economy is not a minor policy tweak. It presents a massive generational burden. And currently, that burden is being shared incredibly unequally.
The demand from rural citizens for an equitable transition is completely valid. If you're going to restructure the energy grid of a nation, the people growing the food cannot be bankrupt in the process. However, turning necessary climate policy into a fabricated culture war paves a direct highway for anti-science populism.
If the state fails to ensure that the Green Revolution protects the rural heartland, they guarantee that disaffected citizens like Dieter will seek refuge, with the only political movements promising to throw themselves on the gears and halt the progress entirely.
You can observe the exact mechanics of this green backlash by examining the German farmers' protests that erupted in early 2024. The spark that ignited thousands of tractors blocking highways wasn't initially an argument over atmospheric science. The spark was purely fiscal incompetence.
The timeline of that fiscal failure is crucial. A constitutional court ruling suddenly forced the German government to find 17 billion euros to legally balance their budget. The court ruled that the government had unconstitutionally reallocated emergency credit lines.
They took money that was legally earmarked exclusively for COVID-19 pandemic emergency measures and quietly shifted it to fund their long-term climate protection initiatives. When the court struck that down, the government had a massive immediate budget hole.
To fill that 17 billion euro void, they scrambled and announced the sudden, unmitigated phase-out of agricultural diesel tax reimbursements. It was an immediate, devastating financial hit targeting a single sector. And the mobilization was instantaneous. Farmers blocked major highways, shipping routes, and city centers with their heavy machinery.
The protests themselves became a focal point for competing political discourses. You can map out exactly how different factions attempted to capture the anger of the farmers. First, you have the discourse of climate policy conservatism, primarily championed by traditional center-right parties like the CDU.
The conservative discourse focuses strictly on the economic metrics. They emphasize the immediate economic harm and the loss of national industrial competitiveness caused by implementing rapid green policies faster than neighboring countries. They frame the current progressive government as chaotic and economically illiterate, imposing an unbearable financial burden on the middle class and the agricultural sector just to satisfy an ideological agenda.
Then you have the discourse of green patriotism. This is the strategy utilized by the AfD. They adopt a highly localized, almost romanticized pseudo-environmentalism. They claim they are the true protectors of the homeland, defending the pristine cultural landscapes and the national soil from industrial wind turbines.
But simultaneously, while claiming to protect the local soil, they entirely dismiss the reality of global anthropogenic climate change. They frame global warming measures as a complete hoax or a vast elite conspiracy designed to subjugate sovereign nations.
And overlapping both the conservative and populist approaches is the broader discourse of climate elitism. Both factions work relentlessly to frame climate policy as an exclusive luxury project for the rich. This is where the concept of punitive ecology takes root.
Punitive ecology is the widespread perception that environmental rules, taxes, and severe financial penalties are applied strictly and mercilessly to the working and rural classes. Meanwhile, the urban elites who draft the policies remain completely insulated from the consequences, either through wealth or geographic privilege.
The most glaring example of how effectively this punitive ecology narrative works is the heating massacre controversy in Germany. The government drafted a law aimed at systematically transitioning residential households away from old fossil fuel boilers toward modern electric heat pumps. On paper, it was a standard infrastructure transition bill.
But the AfD successfully weaponized the communication rollout of that law. They utilize a massive wave of misinformation regarding the actual installation costs and the legally mandated implementation timelines. They created a narrative that government agents were going to show up tomorrow, rip out your functioning gas heater, and hand you a bill for 30,000 euros.
They stoked massive, widespread fears of imminent mass foreclosures and total financial ruin for elderly homeowners who were living on fixed pensions. The material reality of the policy was vastly different from the panic. The government legislation actually included extensive financial protections.
They provided state subsidies that covered up to 35% of the total installation cost for the heat pumps, capped at a maximum of 4,000 euros. The state was literally offering to pay for a massive chunk of the transition.
But the factual details of the subsidies, the nuance of the timelines, and the exemptions for low-income households were completely drowned out. The bureaucratic reality stood no chance against the highly emotional populist narrative that the state was coming to actively bankrupt ordinary citizens.
This communication failure reveals the core issue of fairness and public trust. When you analyze why populations reject environmental policy, you find three core distributional narratives that actively erode public trust. These narratives are pervasive because they feel fundamentally true to the people experiencing them.
The first is the income distribution narrative. This is the widespread, deeply held belief that grid policies, by their very nature, disproportionately burden low-income and middle-income earners. Because flat taxes on carbon or energy affect a much larger percentage of a working-class family's total budget than a wealthy family's budget, the policies are viewed as inherently regressive.
The second is the corporate evasion narrative. Citizens look at the regulatory landscape and perceive that large multinational corporations routinely escape their financial responsibility for massive industrial emissions. They see corporations utilizing tax havens and lobbying for exemptions, leaving the everyday consumer to pay the ultimate price at the gas pump or the grocery store.
The third is the international imbalance narrative. This is the fatalistic argument that any national efforts or any personal economic sacrifices made by a European citizen are entirely futile if massive global emitters, specifically nations like China or India, do not participate proportionally in emission reductions.
These three narratives, income burden, corporate evasion, and international imbalance, are extraordinarily powerful because they all center on a perceived lack of fairness. If a citizen believes the system is fundamentally rigged against them, they will reject the policy regardless of the scientific necessity.
You see this rejection manifest physically in local resistance to renewable energy infrastructure. When a government attempts to build necessary wind turbines or expand the high-voltage transmission grid through a rural area, they often meet fierce local opposition.
And that local opposition is frequently rooted in completely valid grievances. Often the planning processes are opaque. The contracts are awarded to massive outside energy conglomerates, and the local community sees absolutely no financial benefit or procedural justice. They just get the noise and the disrupted landscape.
But instead of addressing the procedural justice, that legitimate local grievance is retroactively hijacked by right-wing populist rhetoric. The populist machine swoops in and transforms a standard local zoning dispute about a wind turbine into a massive national ideological battle against an oppressive eco-dictatorship.
The data is definitive on this point. Public support for progressive climate policies drops off a cliff the exact moment citizens view the distribution of the costs as inherently unfair. The term eco-dictatorship is not just a slogan. It is a highly engineered framing device used to polarize the electorate and stall legislative action.
And this weaponization of climate policy is absolutely not localized to rural Germany. You have to look at the broader European landscape to see the true scale. This is a highly coordinated, continent-wide strategy. The exact same tactics are being used to turn environmental regulation into a battering ram against established democratic institutions across multiple borders.
The continent-wide strategy is evident when you map the recent electoral shocks. Look closely at the United Kingdom. The dynamic played out perfectly in the Uxbridge by-election. The central issue of that entire campaign was the expansion of London's ultra-low emission zone, commonly known as ULEZ.
ULEZ is an environmental policy designed to improve urban air quality. It functions by charging the drivers of older, higher-polluting vehicles a daily fee of £12.50 just to drive within the designated zone. In a vacuum, it is a standard Pigovian tax on pollution.
But the policy was expanded during a severe nationwide cost of living crisis. For a working-class tradesperson relying on an older diesel van to get to job sites, an extra £12.50 a day is financially crippling. The environmental measure instantly became a massive, undeniable focal point for populist backlash.
The Conservative government, under the leadership of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, saw the electoral result in Uxbridge and immediately capitalized on the anxiety. They executed a sharp political pivot. Sunak's government subsequently delayed the long-planned bans on the sale of new gasoline and diesel vehicles.
They pushed back the mandatory phase-outs of traditional gas residential boilers. They marked a highly publicized, significant retreat from the United Kingdom's previously strict, legally binding net zero commitments. The climate target was sacrificed for immediate political survival.
You see an even more dramatic version of this policy collision in the Netherlands. The Dutch government attempted to implement a strict nitrogen emission reduction policy. To comply with European Union environmental standards and protect specific biodiversity zones, the policy required a massive 50% cut in total nitrogen emissions by the year 2030.
Because the Dutch agricultural sector is incredibly dense and intensive, agriculture represents a massive portion of their national economy and their total nitrogen emissions. Hitting a 50% reduction target necessitated aggressively restructuring the industry, including legally mandated, government-compensated farm buyouts.
The concept of the state forcing the buyout of multi-generational family farms triggered an explosive backlash. It wasn't just standard protests. You saw thousands of farmers mobilizing, using massive tractors to block critical national highways, deliberately setting fires using manure and hay bales to disrupt infrastructure.
The intensity of that single environmental policy dispute acted as a total catalyst for the Dutch political landscape. It caused the immediate, meteoric rise of a brand new center-right populist party, the Farmer Citizen Movement, known as the BBB. The BBB swept the provincial elections almost overnight.
And their success emboldened the more established extreme right Party for Freedom, the PVV. The compounding pressure of the agrarian revolt and the right-wing resurgence completely altered the power dynamics of the parliament. It ultimately contributed directly to the collapse of Prime Minister Mark Rutte's long-standing, historically stable coalition government. A mandate on nitrogen emissions took down a prime minister.
When you move south to Italy, you observe a different, highly cynical application of the strategy. You see a deliberate double game being played by Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni.
The double game is fascinating. On the international stage at massive climate summits, Meloni acts the part of the cooperative European stateswoman. She signs the pledges alongside global leaders, officially acknowledging the severe scientific threat of global climate change.
But her domestic rhetoric, broadcast to her voting base inside Italy, is entirely different. She routinely and aggressively blames climate policies rather than the undeniable physical reality of climate change itself for the severe economic hardships facing Italians. She even rhetorically blames the policies for natural disasters.
And the physical reality in Italy is severe. They're on the front line of the crisis. Italy has recently faced catastrophic, devastating floods, uncontrollable wildfires, and unprecedented extreme heat events. The scientific data attributed over 18,000 deaths in Italy specifically to extreme heat waves in just a single month during the summer of 2022.
The economic damage is just as acute. In the northern town of Mortelliano, a single historic hailstorm dropped ice boulders that destroyed roofs and solar panels, causing 80 million euros in catastrophic infrastructure damage in mere minutes.
The population is entirely aware of the threat. Polling shows that 83% of Italian citizens view climate change as a very serious, immediate problem. They are watching their towns flood and their crops wither. Yet, despite the public consensus and the death toll, the populist political maneuvering continues to aggressively target and dismantle the exact environmental regulations that are mathematically required to mitigate those disasters.
You have to look at where this strategy meets resistance to understand the resilience of democratic systems. In Poland, the populist strategy actually encountered a massive structural limit. The Law and Justice Party, the PS, attempted to utilize the exact same playbook against the European Union.
They targeted the EU's Fit for 55 package, which is the comprehensive legislative framework aimed at reducing total European emissions by 55% by the year 2030. The PI explicitly attempted to frame these binding environmental targets as an act of absolute authoritarian overreach by unelected bureaucrats in Brussels.
They utilized the nativist playbook, framing the environmental regulations as a direct existential threat to Polish national sovereignty and the traditional Polish coal industry. They bet their electoral strategy on the green lash.
But that specific strategy met a massive organized resistance at the ballot box. It was countered by an unprecedented demographic shift, a 68.8% voter turnout among the youth.
That youth demographic overwhelmingly and decisively rejected the anti-climate Eurosceptic stance. They understood the environmental necessity and voted out the populist government. The resulting shift in the Polish government immediately led to a recommitment to integrating renewable energy and actively revising the restrictive regulations on wind turbine construction that the PIS had implemented.
That Polish election is a crucial data point because it highlights the ongoing battle over the structural integrity of European democracy itself. The entire continent is defined by the concept of the firewall, or what the Germans term the Brandmauer.
The Brandmauer is the historical cornerstone of post-war European political stability. For decades, there has been a firm, unspoken, but universally respected agreement among all mainstream democratic parties, whether center-left or center-right. They agreed to flatly refuse to govern with or form any legislative coalitions with the extreme right.
It was an institutional quarantine mechanism designed specifically to protect democratic integrity from authoritarian creep. However, as the compounding, simultaneous pressures of economic deprivation, engineered migration panics, and the intense green lash mount, that structural firewall is actively crumbling.
You see it breaking down at the local and regional levels first, where mainstream conservative mayors or governors quietly rely on extreme right votes to pass budgets or block environmental zoning laws. Once the taboo is broken locally, the normalization creeps upward to the national level.
And this threatens the core functionality of the European Union itself. The EU is not a monolith. It functions fundamentally as a massive, highly complex machine of compromise. It is designed to painstakingly balance the diverse, often competing national interests of 27 sovereign states.
But a machine built entirely on compromise slows down, grinds its gears, and eventually fractures entirely when a critical mass of far-right movements successfully infiltrates the chambers. These movements are ideologically opposed to the concept of compromise. They successfully frame the very act of diplomatic concession as an intolerable, treasonous weakness, while elevating absolute, uncompromising national sovereignty as the ultimate moral superiority.
We are seeing the severe, immediate implications of this fracture unfold right now across the legal frameworks of Europe. There is a rapidly growing, undeniable trend toward the strict criminalization of environmental dissent and climate activism.
You can see the legal architecture of this in the United Kingdom's Public Order Act of 2023. The legislation drastically and aggressively enhances the power of the police to preemptively ban, penalize, and imprison citizens engaging in disruptive protests.
The friction and the inevitable failures of implementing massive environmental policy transitions are being aggressively utilized by the state to justify the systematic dismantling of institutional checks and balances. The narrative of restoring order against climate activists or migrants is used to erode judicial independence and restrict the fundamental democratic right to public dissent.
When you synthesize the core operational mechanisms we've examined today, the undeniable mathematical realities of regional economic deprivation, the highly strategic nativist scapegoating of migrant populations, and the deliberate, calculated framing of necessary climate policy as punitive elite overreach, you realize they are not isolated or coincidental phenomena.
No, they are highly interconnected gears operating inside a massive continent-wide political machine. And it is vital to understand that we aren't endorsing any of the specific viewpoints in these movements, but rather breaking down how this machinery functions. This machine is explicitly and intelligently designed to leverage the very legitimate, very real financial anxieties and cultural exhaustion of the working and middle classes, and convert that raw anxiety into entrenched structural political power.
The ultimate vulnerability of the modern democratic state lies not in the radicalism of its fringe opponents, but in its own bureaucratic inability to distribute the immense financial and cultural weight of the 21st century's most necessary transitions evenly across its citizenry.